Good morning, true believers. Welcome to another episode of Sunday Morning Superheroes, where we talk about everything from Samson to Superman. Today, we've got a really special guest to talk to us about the big blue guy. This is David Zwirn. Welcome, David.
How you doing?
Doing well, doing well. One thing I will tell you all about David is he's really special because he is one of my personal pastors. So we know each other in real life quite well. And we've worked together a lot on different dramatic projects. And now we also work at the same college. David also is a professor at the UAHT campus. So, besides that, for more information, tell us, who is David Zwirn?
Well, I guess the reasons that I'm here as a special guest is because yes, I am a Methodist preacher, so I know a little bit about the Methodist Church, Methodist doctrine and theology, and also a lifelong Superman fan. I'm of that generation that literally grew up with Chris Reeve in the movies.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's really cool.
Yeah.
So, how old were you? Was the Chris Reeve the first introduction to Superman you had?
No, the old George Reeves TV show was still you know they still would show reruns. So anytime I like had to stay home sick or whatever, I could always count on watching one of those episodes. Um, and of course, there were all the comic books. I used to have the big, the giant reproduction of Superman #1 that had those first adventures in it. And one of my favorite toys when I was a kid was the big like 12-inch Mego Superman with the Chris Reeve sculpt. I I I wore the hell out of that thing.
That is so cool. I know this is not going to come as a surprise to anyone who can see my face, but I am definitely not old enough to have experienced those things firsthand.
Yeah.
I definitely did not
Whenever
see
I
the
go to Comic Cons, part of me is like always on the lookout to do they have one?
Oh, that so you don't still have the Mego figure, do you?
I don't.
Oh, but
So
that's
if anybody's out there
understandable.
that's got one they want to let go of,
Then let us know.
yeah.
Exactly. We will hook you up with the buyer. That is really cool. I obviously have seen the Reeves movies. I think that they're classics. Obviously,
Yeah.
even
We won't
way
talk about
later in
4
history.
though.
Yes, only. Oh, Superman 4. Yes, yes. We won't talk about it. But I will say as well, the the earlier TV show that you referenced, I haven't seen a lot of that, but what I have seen seems like a hoot and a holler. There's a clip that I show to my students when I'm going through the history of superhero comic books and adaptations that is just absolutely, to me, hilarious, because it's a scene where Superman is saving Perry White, and he's like tied up in one of those old fashioned melodrama type things, and he's in a sawmill, so he's like going towards the saw, and Superman just looks at the saw in this very disapproving manner, and the saw just falls apart. And I just think that is absolutely amazing. It's like the saw just sees Superman and just gives up. Like knows that there's no point in resistance.
Now, the producers, I think, were very smart, knowing that heat does not necessarily cast light. So he's probably just looking at it to heat it up.
Oh, I never thought about that, but that makes
That's
so
my
much
story, and I'm
sense.
sticking to it.
There you go. Cool, cool, cool. Yeah, it is. There's a lot of good Superman media. There is a lot of not great Superman media too. But when there's good Superman stories, they are really good. And
Yeah.
for multiple generations of people, Superman has been the superhero. As a matter of fact, people debate this in, the super nerdy academic realm about whether Superman was or was not the first technical superhero. It also depends largely on how you define that term superhero. But what we can say for certain is that when Action Comics #1, which you were just referencing, you had the reprint of it. When it first hit the shelves,
Superman #1.
Superman #1, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
For those of you that don't know, there are multiple comic book titles that feature Superman.
Yes, and it can get very confusing.
Like it did in the 90s.
Yes. Oh, and the 90s was terrible because they had like 5 or 6 different ones.
They had 4 titles, and the story would continue week by week in the different titles. So you for instance, you would start a story arc in Superman, then it would continue next week in Adventures of Superman, and then next week in Action Comics, and then it would wrap up in Superman the Man of Steel.
Yeah. So, I like to call that a cash grab. In the 90s, that's what they were doing. They were
the good thing about that was you get a fresh installment of the episode every week as opposed to every month.
That's a good point. So pros and cons.
On
the one hand,
it would stack up.
I can imagine. Yes, I can imagine. There's a reason they stopped doing that eventually. And that was in part because of that stacking thing. Oh. But anywho, when Superman's first appearance came out in I think it was 1938 or something like that, it was an instant hit, and it sold more than any other comic book up to that point in history had ever sold, and completely changed the face of comic books after that. Yeah. So Superman from the very beginning was an iconic cultural shaping character. And it is interesting to me that Superman, like many other superheroes, both from DC and even from Marvel, was created by a couple of Jewish kids who were inspired by science fiction on the one hand, and also the biblical stories that they grew up with in synagogue and whatnot from their birth. You probably know a little bit more about those two than I do. Do you want to give some basic background on the creators of Superman?
Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, they, couple of kids from Cleveland. I don't know if you've been to Cleveland. Okay.
I have not been to Cleveland.
Okay. I had to go there a couple of years ago for a academic honors conference, whatever. And before I even left the airport, I got an inkling of just how much Cleveland loves these two guys. Because there's museum exhibits in the airport foyer. You go out onto the street to get a cab. There's a mural across the street. You go to the library. They got multiple exhibits. Cleveland loves Siegel and Shuster because they created Superman.
That is so awesome.
And of course, I felt right at home when
I bet. And that makes me happy because for a long time, those two were not treated well, at least by DC Comics. And so it's nice to see that their legacy is more celebrated, at least by Cleveland nowadays.
Yeah. They got paid like the modern day equivalent of like a couple of $1,000 to sell Superman to what was then National Publications, which became DC, and didn't get any of the royalties or nothing like that. And the way DC has tried to compensate for this is that everything that features Superman in it or on it or whatever, it has to have that little that little credit, Superman created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. So it's sort of a way to at least everyone acknowledges who they are. But I mean,
Yeah.
like they didn't get any royalties off the merch.
Which is where all the money was. And
Well,
that was a big deal. Yeah. But even though these two were Jewish kids, and you can definitely see the influence of
oh yeah,
Hebrew Bible characters like Samson in particular comes to
yeah.
mind.
His 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 origin story echoes that of Moses. You know,
100%.
you can see the parallels just right away.
Yeah, he's in a little basket,
Mm.
except this basket has a rocket on it, right?
Right.
And takes him away from his people who are doomed, right, to this other
Mm.
place where he's then raised in a completely foreign environment, right? But he's like the people who raised him, and yet he's not at the same
Mm.
time.
And he
Yeah.
turns out to be a savior figure.
Yep. Yep. And even though he doesn't save his own people, right, because they were
Mm.
doomed with the Krypton just being destroyed, but he does save the new world that he comes to, and
Yeah.
becomes like the light that leads them. Yeah, obvious parallels. But over time, of course, Superman's origin gets changed and elaborated on and altered as we go forward, with different writers besides the original
Yeah.
creators coming in and writing stories. And part of what, at least from my vantage point, seems to happen with Superman is they try to make him much more of a kind of, generally speaking, American icon figure. He kind of has some similarities to Captain America in the DC kind of marketing world, especially in like the 50s and 60s, where
Yeah,
he starts to
because that's Cold War era.
exactly. He's fights for truth, justice, and the American way,
In the American
right?
way.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
in recent decades, since the fall of the Soviets, they kind of just dropped the American way. He still fights for truth and justice,
Yep.
just now on a more global scale.
Global scale. Yeah, exactly. But while in that time, um, they seem to have done a lot to make his backstory and his figure represent general speaking American culture rather than a subculture inside of it. So, like for instance, they go into a lot more detail about him being raised in a small town, right? And that small town gets a name, Smallville,
Right.
and they have that whole Superboy series, right, which is all about Superman as a teenager in Smallville and what his upbringing was like. And they make him a very kind of typical small town American boy growing up to man with the small town values. And in America, especially in the 50s and 60s, those small town values included you going to church on Sunday, right? Being a church going
Mm.
family, church going stuff. For the most part, they didn't specify any particular denomination that he was going to. It was kind of just vaguely Protestant. But then in more recent comics, they have canonically made him a Methodist. So that is the denomination that Superman comes from, his background. And that brings us to the main topic of today, which is Methodism and Superman, since that is at least one version of the canon. I always have to be careful with that word canon because it's so flexible now. It's like, well, which canon are you talking about? Because they change it all the time. But at least for the mainstream canon at the moment,
Yeah.
as far as I know, he is a United Methodist. So this is an area you know a lot more than me about. For those of us who have no clue what a Methodist is, what is a Methodist, generally speaking?
Methodism, it started off as a movement in the Anglican Church. Um, John and Charles Wesley were they were Anglican clergymen who felt that a lot of people just weren't taking a relationship with God seriously enough. Right? They felt that most people thought it was just kind of much more of a hobby, much more of a social interaction thing. You go to church to see and be seen, and not everybody was allowed in. This was a time when if you paid enough money, you could get your own box pew and sit and listen to the preacher. If you couldn't afford a box pew, you couldn't come to church. And the Wesleys were like, this needs to change. So they came up with a structure and a method for acting out your faith, acting out your beliefs. And they became so methodical that people started to insult them and called them Methodists, and just the name stuck.
So that's really important to know. So in its origin, Methodism, like the Wesley brothers, or the Wesley Bros, if you prefer, right? They never set out to start a denomination. They were part of the Anglican Church, and it was a movement inside of that church.
The whole reason that it became a denomination in and of itself is a direct product of the Revolution. People in America all of a sudden wanted nothing to do with Britain, including their church, but they still wanted to have church. So they wrote to John Wesley saying, can you just make us our own church and let us do our own thing? And Wesley was very reluctant to start that process.
Yeah, but I think that's important. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just the people kept pressuring him to do it, so he sent over the first two presiding bishops, and that's how the Methodist Church in America got its start. And the history of the church is a pretty good parallel to the history of America. The church expanded with America. The church split as America split along, for the same reasons, basically.
You're talking about during the Civil War, right?
Yeah. Where it became the Methodist Episcopal Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church South. And it wasn't until the mid 20th century that they got back together.
Wow. So that split lasted for longer than the duration of the Civil War, actually.
Oh yeah,
right?
much longer.
Wow, that is gnarly. I didn't know that. That's very, very interesting.
And and now we've just had another split in the church as well that kind of parallels that hot button topic on LGBT plus inclusion. And
yeah, it
who
does
knows when
seem.
that dust will settle.
I apologize. I talked over you. Will you say that again?
I just said God only knows how that's all going to shake out, how all that dust is going to settle.
Yeah, I get that. I'm somewhat reminded of like a couple people I know at the college who about certain current events say, I really kind of wish that I could just go into a coma and then wake up when all this stuff is settled and then I could read about it in a history book or something. That would be nice to be retrospect. But yeah, I get that. So that's really, really. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's because of moments of turmoil and chaos and uncertainty like that people are going to look for heroes. They're going to look for figures to look up to, and if they got to find them in the pages of a book or a comic book, so be it.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know, they're going to look to aspire to.
That's right. And I feel like the way you've laid out Methodism in a nutshell, and I know that you're holding back too, because like I'm just a little bit aware, but I know lots of people are more aware. Like Wesley studies is a whole thing, like a whole
Oh yeah,
academic branch to study Wesley himself, the Wesley brothers, and the whole history of Methodism as it develops. That's like a
yeah,
whole field of study you could go into if you wanted to.
yeah. Oh
But
yeah.
yeah, even the kind of thumbnail sketch that you've given us, I think is very enlightening that it, like you said, it reflects the history of America as a whole, because it really first became its own denomination with the American Revolution, where it becomes separate from Anglicanism. And then it expands, like you said, with America. It reflects the divisions in American history, et cetera, et cetera. That I think works really well for the Superman character, because, you know, even though it wasn't originally stated that he was a United Methodist, that actually works really well as him being a kind of icon of an American superhero, being a part of a denomination that reflects American history so well.
It does, and they're both products of their time. You know, the Methodist Church was a product of the Revolution and the Enlightenment. You know, this moment in time where people were agreeing, you know, all men are created equal,
Yeah,
and Superman, of course, is a product of his time. You know, nobody knew when the Depression was going to end. There was the threat of fascism growing in Europe. You know, Hitler spouting off a lot of anti-Semitic rhetoric, and people in general were just needing a sense of empowerment. People were needing a sense of hope and aspiration, and I think that more than anything else is what gave Superman such popularity.
agreed. And the character also has kind of meshed and molded and grown and developed over time to what people in the culture needed. Because, like, in those early Superman comics, his personality is quite different than what Superman eventually develops. Like, Action Comics #1, his first appearance, the Superman persona is very much like the tough guy of the 30s, you know, kind of persona.
There's a scene in that first issue where he goes up against a guy who's beating his wife, and he just takes him by the throat and says, you know, throws him against a wall, and he says, "You're not fighting a woman now." Contrast
Exactly.
that with a more recent issue where Clark is in his apartment, and he hears the same kind of thing going on, and you know, as a reflection of the time, wrestling with himself, saying, "Do I have the right to go and interfere? But somebody's in trouble. How do I not?" You know, so he has this whole existential crisis. Your
Cool.
audio just got okay. There it is.
Oh, am I here? Sorry.
Yeah, yeah. I just couldn't hear you for a second.
Cool. That's so enlightening, like to show where that how that character has changed from point A to point B, right? Of how we got
Yeah.
there.
And that's not overnight, of course. There's been
No.
70, 80 years of growth and evolution.
Yeah.
I mean, this
And
was also a time when
evolution
Superman couldn't
from
fly.
yeah. Oh yeah, he couldn't even fly in the beginning. No, no, not at all. And yeah, like the development of like at the beginning, this tough guy who's gonna go in there, right, and just right the problems of society. Because
He,
another
he
thing is
He was a
Right.
very progressive social reformer character.
Yes. He was a social justice warrior, right?
Yeah,
Of his time. He wasn't fighting supervillains in the beginning. He was fighting
yeah.
wife beaters, crooked politicians, right?
Gangsters.
Gangsters, exactly. He was
If
dealing
you
with very real life issues
Yeah,
for the
if you
time.
that's also kind of reflected in those early, um in the early radio episodes and in the Fleischer cartoons,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know,
There's
that,
actually a oh, sorry. Go
you know,
ahead.
and never mind that the Fleischer cartoons are also adding, like, giant robots and a Godzilla-esque kinda, but whatever, but yeah, but it was about, but Superman was very no nonsense in his dealings with the more human characters, the gangsters and the criminals and the con artists and the mad scientists.
Yeah, exactly. He just went in there and he cleaned it up. It
Mhm.
was kind of the what I get from those comics, which again is what everyone was needing, right? Everyone was hoping for somebody who would just have the power to go in and fix all of these issues
Yeah,
that were going on in their society. And so it made sense.
yeah.
And
People had spent a whole decade in the 30s saying, "Can somebody please do something about all this mess?" You know,
yeah,
Roosevelt was doing what he could, and and people just needed that, that hero character.
yeah, for sure. It's interesting that you bring up the radio drama too, because I recently learned that there was actually a storyline in the radio dramas that, it took up a lot of episodes, but it was about Superman going against the KKK. They weren't called the KKK in the episodes, but they were obviously the KKK,
Yeah,
right? They were called like the Clan of the Flaming Cross or something like that, like very thinly veiled thing about the KKK. And that once again, that's totally in line with what Superman was about from the beginning of combating very real world
mhm.
issues of corruption and evil in American society.
And again, this also reflects Methodism, particularly in the early part of the 20th century. Is Methodists were advocating for social justice as well. They were advocates for women's suffrage. They were advocates for um, decent working hours and a living wage. Um, they were also the driving force behind prohibition, which
Well,
eventually didn't turn out quite as well.
no. But I feel
But
like Prohibition was one of those things where it was
the
like,
intent was good.
the intent was good. Hindsight is 2020,
Yeah,
right? Where
exactly.
after the fact. Yeah. But that also just makes sense with the whole impetus for Methodism, the idea of living out your faith, right?
Hmm.
Not letting it just be like a social club that you go to or this kind of performative art for rich folks, right? And the whole thing about being able to pay for the best seats to listen to the preacher talk, like that's it's so
Yeah,
crazy. Like the idea of going out into the world and actually living what you believe out there,
yeah,
making a difference in people's lives. Like that just correlates with Superman so well. Like with how much of an active driving force Superman is portrayed as in those comics. It just to me just makes total sense.
yeah. And it occurs to me now to wonder. Some of the viewers of this podcast might be wondering, well, why is he a Methodist? Why that particular denomination? Um, Because if you don't know, Superman is not the only comic book character to have any kind of religious affiliation. But I think,
Definitely.
yeah, the whole reason for this, if I recall correctly, is because when Elliot S. Maggin was the head writer for Superman, and from like the late '60s all the way up to early '80s, like right before the whole Crisis era. If you know, you know.
Yes, if you know, you know.
Yeah, and Maggin said in an interview one time that he always gives whatever character he's working on a religious background. A, because it helps with the backstory, and it makes a more relatable character. And Maggin figured, okay, he's growing up in, in the Midwest America. You know, he's grown up in rural Kansas, so he's probably either a Methodist or a Southern Baptist, and he went with Methodist.
Yeah, that's actually a good thing to bring up. So, you know, very famous now from the TV show, right? Smallville,
Yeah,
of Superman's small hometown in Kansas, right? What is the connection? Why is it that Methodism in particular, along with Southern Baptists, like you said, is so popular among like the more rural areas in America?
probably because I like to think that, again, Methodism expanded and grew with America, right? So as the frontier kept going further and further west, the Methodist Church was right there with it. You know, it was the Methodist Church's goal to have a church planted like within 10 miles of each other, which is why now you can just take a drive and find Methodist churches on with but that was before you know that was before automobiles, where people would walk, or if they had a wagon, they'd take their wagon and go that
Yeah,
distance
that's a
to the local church.
I think that's kind of a joke now, actually, because, like you said, it's become a little bit obsolete at this point when you do have cars. But there are lots of small towns. Like Texarkana isn't that big of a city comparatively, right? And still, you can throw a stone almost. And, the joke is hit a Methodist church with the stone, because it's still big enough that back in the old days it would have been most convenient for people to just walk to a church. And there was
Yeah,
that push in the Methodism to have those churches there.
right.
Yeah. There's also, though, I think they have that on the small scale, but I think there's also kind of a more holistic national view inside of the UMC historically. I know that this is not the case in every situation today inside of Methodism, but there was a time I know when Methodist pastors rotated very, very frequently, like every 2 years,
Yeah.
right? They would be moved
Mhm.
somewhere else in the country.
Yeah,
And that's
if you're an ordained elder, that will still hold true, that you'll get rotated more frequently. If you're just um, a licensed local, like my wife is, or just a lay supply like I am, you could stick around for a while.
yeah, which again seems to reflect that kind of idea of the whole country, right? Instead of just the local churches are still important. They're,
Yeah,
the lifeblood of the church. But then there's also this, not letting I would imagine that that would keep pastors from ever totally forgetting the broader strokes, nature of the church and the nation as a
yeah,
whole.
and it's the elders that used to do circuit riding, which is they would go to one church one week to like give them communion or do whatever baptisms they needed to do, which you can't do on a lower level. If you've got a lay person trying to keep the church going week to week, they're not authorized to do that kind of thing. So an elder would come in, right? So you'd go to one church one week, and then the next church on the circuit the next week, and you just do that whole circuit.
Yeah.
And nowadays we have the licensed locals who can do those sacraments for their congregation.
Yeah. Again, just the church, it continues to change with the nation, right? As the country evolves, as it changes, so Methodism adapts to it. Yeah. And as Superman does, like we talked about, as Superman changes as a character.
George Reeves' thing was, truth, justice, and the American way. That was the thing every kid who watched that show grew up with. And in the Chris Reeve movies, his whole vibe, and Reeve actually said this in an interview, was his energy was more just like, "Hi there, I'm here to help."
Yeah. Instead of on a specific national level, it was just generally speaking, here to help.
Yeah, and that kind of the kind of teamwork idea, at the end of the first movie, when Superman brings Lex Luthor and Otis into the prison yard, and the warden is like, "This country is safe again, Superman, thanks to you," with that kind of energy. And Superman is like, "Oh no, sir, warden, we're all part of the same team." So it's that kind of embracing that he's not doing this by himself.
Which is another thing I actually think relates to Methodism more. That if you do make that connection of, okay, the character grew up in a Methodist church, then it makes sense, because another thing I've noticed about Methodism that I like a lot is how humble overall as a denomination Methodists are. Mm-hmm. There is very much this sense of, we don't have all the answers, right? There's lots of stuff that we don't know. Let's work together on the things that we know God has for us.
And it's a much more pragmatic theology. I think there's a reason why the cliche is that a Methodist's favorite spiritual weapon is a casserole.
That's a great line. But that is so awesome, because there are certain denominations that I think get too caught up in doctrine and having a doctrine for every single last possible thing, right? They've got a doctrine for instrumentation on Sunday. I jest a little bit, but some denominations are much more kind of concerned with making sure that you are right on every single last possible point of doctrine. Whereas the Methodist Church, I find, keeps the main thing and allows for a lot more. We've got lots of Methodist pastors who disagree with each other about all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, we do. And just for the record, I'm not trying to knock any other denomination.
Oh, yes, definitely.
I'm not trying to paint up Methodism as any better or worse or any nearer to God than anybody else.
Definitely. And I'm not either, for the record. I'm not either, for the record. I believe that we're all in the same boat. Everybody who confesses Christ, we're all in the same boat. We're all in this together.
But I think Superman's connection to Methodism can be summed up very simple. And this has become a little more played up recently. There's a scene in Man of Steel, and say what you will about the Snyderverse. If you think maybe that Superman's a little too dark and brooding, but again, that's a reflection of the time. But Clark actually does go talk to a priest in a church, and then also kind of reflecting his evolution when he gets this encouragement from the image of his late father Jor-El that he has to go stop General Zod. Right, he leaves the craft and he goes out, like this. You can't really see it on the screen, but his arms are out like this, and his legs are right out there in a crucifix position, making it very overt of how Superman has achieved this savior status.
Definitely. And that's the thing again, even though as you've said to me, I think offline, you said the original creators of Superman, being two Jewish kids, definitely did not have Christian ideas in mind when they created Superman. But through this whole process,
imagery.
What was that? Sorry?
Or at least not Christian imagery.
Yeah, not Christian imagery for sure. But through the history of that character, right? In part, I think, again, in their attempt to make him more American, they did have made him more Christian over the time as it goes on. And we see that pop up all over the place. Like, even that storyline of like the death and return of Superman, is very Christological in nature.
And that had a lot of religious overtones to it as well. There were scenes in the comic books where people would be gathered right outside Superman, and they'd have this revival meeting going on.
Yeah,
and you can't help making those connections. But I think the thing that really encapsulates all of this is there's a quote by John Wesley that demonstrates the sort of pragmatic nature of Methodist belief and Methodist action. And he said, "Do all the good you can to all the people you can, by whatever means you can, forever as long as you can." And I'm probably missing a few of those as well, but you get the idea. And that's basically Superman's whole job description.
100%. And I think that's what makes, I think more than anything else, what makes Superman special as a character. This is not an original idea to me either. I think the author Kelly Edwards actually said this first. But the fact that this is a being who has these godlike powers on Earth, he doesn't have any trauma, right? He doesn't have his planet died, but he doesn't remember that, right? He was an infant. He never really knew his parents. He had a good childhood, right? With
he only discovers that when he's a young adult and can
exactly
process it.
Yeah, exactly. And he, with those powers, could have done and been anything he wanted to be. And he just decides that he's going to dedicate his life to helping people. You
want a good what if, just watch Brightburn.
Oh no. I just can't take that movie. Like, the whole idea of it just
as it might have been different.
Yeah,
and
it might have been.
Thank God that it wasn't.
Exactly. but that's what I think makes Superman so special. And I totally get, the people who critique Superman as a character of like, it's so hard to write an engaging story with a being who's bulletproof, and all of that kind of stuff. It's hard to create stakes, all that sort of thing. I totally get that. But I think that that's what makes him interesting as a character. It's not as much about the stakes of the story and whether he'll survive or not, but in the fact of here's this guy who, like you said, just decides that he's going to use these powers to help people without any trauma in his life to make him do that. Right? He just chose to do that.
And going back to, because we had mentioned the death of Superman, and while they were doing that, I think the writers and editors at DC realized they had a great opportunity to give us a world where we didn't have it. Right, that was the whole story arc: world without Superman, and characters that had been introduced that thought Superman was kind of cheesy or lame, that he needed to be, more of a badass like Batman or Guy Gardner, or, something like that. Suddenly find that without Superman, there is a need, right? Even with all the other superheroes in that universe, Superman is still the guiding light.
And that's because, like, as much as there is a place for those other types of heroes, and I will say I'm a pretty big Batman fan. I'm a bigger Batman fan than I am a Superman fan. But even with those characters, yeah, even with all those characters, there's still a need for Superman, because there's still a need for that character who is seeking to follow that Wesleyan code of doing all the good you can for as many people as you can for as long as you can, just because he knows it's the right thing to do. And that's where I think the drama comes from in those Superman stories, is because the question of like, Clark knows that he has the capacity to do more good than most people can because of the nature of his powers and how to do that effectively. And that's like the really interesting thing about Superman to me anyway.
Yeah. And there, there are stories where the focus is not on him, but on, somebody else, some human character that gets introduced or whatever, and seeing the impact that Superman's influence has on their lives. He could prevent a suicide from happening. He could, reunite siblings separated by the Holocaust. Things like that.
Yeah. And somewhat, reflective of, again, American culture and perhaps the role of, I wouldn't say here just Methodists, but probably all Christians in general. Superman brings out both the best and the worst in different types of people, right? Because on the one hand, he inspires people to heroism in their own ways. And then some people, like Lex Luthor, most notably, right? He brings out the worst in
people who want to be in that power themselves.
Exactly. And like the most interesting versions of Lex Luthor to me are the ones where he started out as like this philanthropist figure in Metropolis, and then Superman comes in and kind of steals the limelight from him, and that's where he starts to more overtly do the villainous things in his jealousy of Superman. Because you see that Luther is not somebody who does good just because it's the good thing to do, but he's motivated by narcissism and the need to be adored.
Yeah, he's doing the right thing because it'll make him popular.
Exactly. He
And,
needs people to
and
love
because
him.
it's that's his flex. That's Lex's flex.
Exactly. Whereas Superman, like you said, like in the Christopher Reeves movie, when he says we're all on the same team, he really means it. He really doesn't see himself as better than other people. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, as we're coming up here at the end of our hour, I'd like to end with some of our personal best or most cherished moments, I want to say, with Superman. And I'll start with mine and then you can give yours. My biggest memories of Superman go back to when I was a kid, and one of my grandpas, Grandpa Gary, actually is a huge Superman fan. And so that was where I experienced Superman most, actually, was because of Grandpa Gary. And I can remember this one time where I saw at Sam's, they had like this metal tin that was like the complete collection of all the Christopher Reeve movies. And I had never seen all of them at that point. I think I'd seen like the first one. And I spent like a huge chunk of my Christmas or birthday money, one of the two, on that collection. And then I went, and the next time we visited my grandma and grandpa, I watched a bunch of those movies with him. And that is one thing I will always remember and treasure about that Superman character, is that connection with my grandpa.
Yeah. I remember watching Superman 2 a lot when I was in grade school, because that was the one we had taped off of cable at the time. I mean, I would watch that over and over and over. So I have pretty good memories and pretty good remember of the dialogue of that. I will tell you the story. That I used to have a pair of Superman pajamas, and with the underoos, with the the red and the gold, and frequently I would dress up. It came with its own little cape, and I would put that on, and then I would put on other clothes over that, and I would play Clark Kent, and when she was up to it, my sister would play Lois Lane.
Aww.
Yeah. And there was one evening we were playing, and my parents and their friends were in the next room playing bridge. And so my sister and I are playing, and she's like, "Superman, help!" So I run into our walk-in closet, which at that moment was going to be a phone booth. And then the reality that I don't have super speed comes into play. And my parents hear this in the next room. My sister saying, "Superman, hurry up!" And I'm like, "I'll be right there." And it was
it doesn't quite work like in the cartoons.
Not so much. And my parents told me afterwards it was all they could do not to just burst out in raucous laughter at what they were hearing.
That's awesome.
But even that, dressing up as Superman, whether you have the full, costume or pajamas, or you just have a bath towel around you, or whatever, giving you a chance to feel stronger, that you can feel more capable and more able to deal with those things. And since we're talking about the religious associations with that, I think when Scripture says to put on Christ, clothe yourself with Christ, putting a Superman cape on is a little more down to earth version of that, but I think it's kind of the same concept. You clothe yourself in those garments of truth and of righteousness. If you can't find the strength within yourself, you find it in Christ.
Exactly. That's so awesome, David. That reminds me of a C.S. Lewis quote where he was talking about praying the Lord's Prayer, since it starts with the words "Our Father." He was saying that whenever you do that, whenever you say that, you are to some degree play acting Jesus. Like by putting God in the place of your father, you're play acting Jesus. And he said, this is going to feel really ridiculous to you at first, right? Because it's going to become very obvious how you are not like Jesus in all of these different various ways. But he says, but that's the whole point. Because as you put on that mindset of pretending to be like Jesus, like you pretend to be like Superman as a kid, you act in a certain way. Okay, Superman would do this, he wouldn't do this, right? And C.S. Lewis says the same thing. So if you're dressing up like Jesus, you're going to be aware of certain things in your life that you're currently doing that Jesus wouldn't do. And then Lewis is like, well, stop doing them. Or some things that you aren't doing that Jesus would do, go do those things, So I think that that's a really good analogy.
Again, it's all about what you aspire to.
Exactly. And obviously, no Christian, Methodist, Episcopal, Baptist, Catholic, whatever, none of us believes that any of us will ever actually succeed in being exactly like Jesus, more than you dressing up as Superman made you like Superman with the superhuman speed and such.
Yeah.
But the whole point is that's what we aspire to. And by aspiring and with the help of the Holy Spirit of Christ, we become more like him every day.
Exactly.
Awesome.
I'll wrap it up with one more issue that I remember. And it was, again, this is one that was not focused on Superman. This was focused on a guy. He was like an ex-con, I think, if I remember right, who, as a joke, his fellow inmates, drugged him while he was in prison and tattooed the Superman S big and bold on his chest. But when he got out, he found himself taking on this role of helper and protector. So sort of as a means of redemption. And
that is so cool. That's exactly like we will. Go ahead.
Sometimes you can find pretty good theology in comic books.
You can. That's what this whole show is about, right? All the very interesting stuff you can find. There is so much to explore, and that's why I'm so grateful for guests like you who come on the show, and for all of you out there who are crazy enough to listen to this podcast about superheroes and the Bible and Christianity and Judaism, all the different stuff we talk about. I appreciate you guys so much. I actually do a lot of times in this show in closing prayer, and I'm springing this on you, David. But since you are a pastor, would you do the honors of closing us out in prayer today?
Sure. Gracious Lord, thank you for our imaginations. Thank you for the gift you give us of longing for something greater than ourselves. Forgive us when we misplace that. And help us to grow so that as we, in our youth, we may see a figure like Superman or King Arthur or somebody like that as something to aspire to. As we get older and we become more mature, help us to set our eyes towards you as what we can aspire to. Through your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, who showed us what it is to be a child of both worlds, both fully human and fully divine, and help us aspire to grow more to you and more like your Son every minute of every day. Amen.
Amen. Thank you again, David. This has been
My
an awesome
pleasure.
conversation.
It's like Coca-Cola, Levi's